Happened again. Yeah, the King Tiger broke down in the middle of the road. Alright, we gotta go ahead and move it. And here's a video I'm pretty sure no one saw coming. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this O-scale Caterpillar D47U Bulldozer. The model that you see here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. Although this model here is slightly outside of that purview, if anyone is interested in having me work on subject matter in this scale over here, I could be reached from the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. The model in this video is built predominantly out of the box. However, I went ahead and made some custom mods to it, bringing it up to the configuration that we have here. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the base starter model, as well as going over several of the modifications that went into bringing the model up to the condition that we have here. So stay tuned, because there's going to be a bunch of info coming right at you. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the Caterpillar D47U Bulldozer. The Caterpillar D4 first entered into production in this format in 1938. This design replaced the RD4, which was the predecessor to this vehicle here. The D4 was a very successful design and was in production for a long period of time. The vehicle entered into production in 1938, but production of this particular pattern ceased in 1959. The crawler weighed in anywhere between 9,000 pounds to about 11,000 pounds fully loaded. The vehicle was a very adaptable platform, and Caterpillar offered this version in a multitude of different configurations, with the differences being in the width of the track to even the type of attachments where it could have, from a standard crawler to one with a PTO to any other type of dedicated bulldozer. The Caterpillar D4 was able to suit these needs. The D4 was powered by a 4-cylinder diesel engine and utilized a 5-speed gearbox. The diesel engine, just like with all the other Caterpillar tractors of the time, featured a pony engine in order to start the diesel. The D4 was a very popular platform, as I just mentioned before, in civilian and commercial use, but also militarily. This vehicle was very widely adopted and was used to great effect by the U.S. military during World War II. The U.S. military adopted several versions of the D4, two of which that are the most common are the bulldozer variants, one of which is using a hydraulic system to operate the main plow, while the other utilized a Laterno cable type system in order to fulfill the same purpose. The D4 saw wide service on both the Pacific and European theaters during World War II. These bulldozers were used by the U.S. military for a good period of time until they were eventually phased out and replaced with other more modern, contemporary bulldozers of the period, many of which were again from Caterpillar. The D4, along with its two bigger brothers, the D7 and the D8, are really some of the more unsung heroes of World War II. Most of the limelight goes to tanks and planes and things like that. However, the engineering vehicles, such as these bulldozers, were instrumental in the U.S. war effort and did contribute quite greatly to the Allied victory in World War II. Before we continue with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the project. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this O-scale Caterpillar D47U Bulldozer. This model here is entirely made out of a single 3D printing, which you'll see once I take it out of its shipping bag that I have the model sitting in at the moment. This particular model does have an interesting background to it, because I actually do have some personal involvement with the development of this little piece over here, which I'll touch upon momentarily. These models here are actually something that are listed on the market and are available for purchase. They can be found via the Shapeways store link listed below. The vendor, who by the way has nothing to do with EastCoastArmory.com, sells these bulldozers in a multitude of different formats, where this particular example here is the O scale version, but he also offers it in HO, 172, and I believe there's another one that I may be missing. The smaller scale ones also come in a number pack where with one set you have 5 bulldozers, which is something that's great if you're going to use it for a train layout, which is basically how this model here came about being designed, and really its original intended purpose. But we'll be touching more upon that once I get the thing out of the bag. And I think it's about time I go ahead and take this thing out of its packaging, which, by the way, for the packaging, it is found in this illustrious Ziploc bag here because shapeways.com, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So we'll go ahead and carefully pull this thing out. So with the unit removed from the packaging, you get a better idea on what the quality of the model looks like. As I stated before, obviously the model is all 3D printed, and it's printed as one integral unit. The material is the HD material, and you notice the entire bulldozer is printed in this media. This is so that the model has the best possible surface detailing that you can get with this type of a format. So let's go ahead and circle back to how this thing came to be. Well, if you're a fan of the channel, you'll note that recently I actually posted a detailed walk-around video of a real Caterpillar D47U. In fact, it's our Caterpillar D4 that was restored. The vehicle is just sitting there in our yard, and one of my relatives saw it and absolutely loved it. He, at the time, was starting to get back into trains and was looking for just implements to put around his train layout and even have something to tug along with his rolling stock. Well, he went ahead to try to see what was on the market for bulldozers because, you know, he had the idea after seeing the real one, and he was surprised to find out that there weren't really any good options out there for Cats on the market. There were one or two, but either they were crazy expensive or they were of a newer style or design and didn't really fit to what he was looking for. So what he went ahead and did was he reached out to a designer and he wanted to have the unit designed per his specs. And for reference, he used the real Caterpillar D4 that was restored in the other video. With those detailed photographs, as well as with the measurements that were supplied, the designer was able to come up with the unit that we have here, but in a much smaller scale for HO. The person got the file, was happy with it, but he saw some room for improvement. The bulldozer originally was missing a few of the rollers on the bottom portion over here, as well as a few other smaller details. The person came to me because he knew I was doing stuff in CAD and said, hey, can you go ahead and make some tweaks to this unit to, make it a little bit more accurate? I said, sure, no problem. So I went ahead, opened up the CAD file, and I made the appropriate modifications to the unit to bump up the accuracy of the piece, making it more like the real Cat D4. Along with that, another request that was made by the person was to make the model better for shipping. Because of the way this unit is designed, it has this nice little umbrella here, as per the real example, of course, but although it's nicely detailed, it's a bit on the fragile side, specifically during shipping. So I went ahead and designed the system that we have here, where we have this cage set up that gives structure support to the umbrella, but it doesn't make contact with the floor, and the whole bulldozer is actually suspended on it to make freeing of these parts much more easily done. The same design was incorporated on the smaller units that are produced by the vendor, and after making them in HO, he decided to, play around with different scales. And him being a train guy, he got into O scale, and of course, needless to say, he wanted one, again, in O scale. So we went ahead, made the appropriate measurements, and scaled the model up to the way we see it here. Because of the work that I did, he went ahead and gifted me this particular unit and said, you know what will be cool, John? If you go ahead and make one of these as an army bulldozer, because the Cat D4 was a bulldozer that was used by the U.S. military to great extent during both World War II and also Korea. And since this pattern over here of the D4 was one that was used during that era, this would be a perfect candidate to go ahead and render it in that configuration. And that is exactly how this model here is going to be built and painted. Before I go ahead and take this thing off of the sprue and actually dig into this project, I might as well go ahead and show some of the detail quality on the raw printing. Of course, this is all going to be more appreciated once the model is fully painted and weathered, but hopefully at this point here you can get a good idea on the level of detailing that is found on this component straight out of the packaging. Unfortunately, one thing I neglected to do during the build was to show how to remove the dozer off of the support cage. But here we have the cage right here, so I might as well briefly go over it. The technique that I used was the following, where the small little fragile points that we have in these four sections, which make contact with that umbrella, are snipped away with a pair of clean cut snips like I have here. You simply go and you snip the appropriate locations, freeing the umbrella. Then the next trick was to remove the dozer off of the base. The dozer is held on via these three columns that are in these locations. This one here I use the clean cut snips to remove. However, the other two are a bit out of reach, specifically with the length of the dozer's body and also with the blade. To remove the other two columns, I incorporated the Dremel, and the Dremel bit that was used was this small little router bit that I have here. The vendor that I used, that I purchased these bits from, can be found in the video description listed below. I mention them frequently in these videos, and I always buy from them because they have good stuff. Anyway, the router bit is used to just remove the material that is directly around the column that we have here. Fortunately, with the material being translucent, you can see exactly where the item is, and you can just remove the appropriate material accordingly. Once the material is removed, the entire bulldozer just pops right off, and you then have it separated. To further remove the column that is remaining, which is now on the bottom portion of the bulldozer's chassis, this is done with a Dremel with a small high-speed removal bit. Of course, these bits can be found just about in any hardware store, and they're highly recommended for anyone who does modeling. They come in handy quite a bit. If anyone watches this channel, you'll see that I frequent this bit quite often. And that's really all there is to it in order to remove the bulldozer from the support cage over here in one piece. This obviously is the case for the O-scale version, but the same technique can also be incorporated on the smaller scale counterparts, which are again in 1/72 and also in HO. So starting with the model's suspension, this model is very similar along the lines of the Bob Semple tank that I completed a little while ago, where the entire suspension unit is integrally printed as one printing. This does have some pros and cons to it. The number one pro is that this streamlines assembly immensely in that there literally is none, so you can't really screw up the assembly of the track or anything. However, one con that this does have is in terms of painting. Obviously, just like with all tracked vehicles, there are lots of little nooks and crannies found in these locations over here, and trying to get them thoroughly painted is probably the biggest challenge of a model like this. The model, fortunately, I was able to thoroughly paint it with the flat black that I used as a primer, and then the base coats were applied with the airbrush, but this did take some careful painting to make sure that these areas were painted in a way where they have the coat of paint on them, but they were not overly saturated with paint to cause unnecessary things like drips or other unwanted type problems. With the camera readjusted, you should be able to get a better idea on the level of detailing found on the tracks. So each of the track links are independently rendered, and you have all of the detailing on each of the link, including the main grouser, as well as also the fasteners that are used to bolt the grouser plate to the inner chain, which of course is how these units would hinge together and articulate with one another. If I try to hold the unit up to the light, you can see the interior detailing here of the chain, and all of that detailing is integrally printed on as well. Also on this location, you get to see the Fastener Hub details found right here on the rear sprocket plate, as well as the open spokes that are present on the rear sprocket itself. The tracks have the articulated sag to them in this area over here, where they go upward to roll over the single roller right here in the center of the crawler, and then they bend downward in a symmetrical pattern. Of course, this was lifted directly off of the real vehicle that was being used as reference. The last thing I want to mention on the lower section is one that's quite notable for me specifically, is with the belly armor. On the bottom portion of these Caterpillars, there's this giant sled that's found in this section over here, and this is a armor plate to protect the bottom portion from any sort of damage that can occur during operation. And this armor is thick and is insanely heavy. On the real vehicle, I actually took off all the fasteners and almost dropped the unit entirely because we had to get a ton of mud, like literally a ton of mud, out from the inside over there during the restoration. And I stopped 3/4 of the way because I realized if I was able to take the thing off fully, I did not have the hoisting capabilities to remount it back in place. So fortunately, I was able to put the bolts back in and call it a day. But one thing that's noteworthy about that whole event is this hook that we have over here, because this was something I was looking at quite often during the fastener removal process, and I gotta say that the designer went ahead and rendered the hook out quite perfectly. So take it from me, a guy who was lying down over here for about 2 or 3 days trying to get these fasteners out. Yeah, the geometry on this piece was very nicely rendered. On the front of the machine takes to the blade, and the Bulldozer blade itself is equally nicely rendered as with many other features that I already touched upon. The one area where the designer really did a nice job with was with the bottom scrape plates that we have right here. He rendered them into 3 separate fittings, which is as per the real unit, and also he rendered out little fasteners that are used to secure these units to the blade body. The next thing I want to mention involves the front brush guard that we have here, or as we know around these parts, the Grasshopper Face. The Grasshopper Face is this very large perforated plate that gets fastened to the radiator frame, and obviously this would be to protect the fragile radiator from any sort of objects that can crash into this area over here, causing some severe damage. Well, the piece on the model is very nicely rendered, and one really cool thing about it is the way the designer designed the perforations found on the plate here. The perforations, as far as I can tell, look to be a dead ringer to the real one, and one nice thing the way he rendered it was that he rendered these holes nice and deep, and because of that, they really do print out very nicely. And during the painting and the weathering specifically, I went ahead and took a wash of black into these sections over here to really highlight all those little perforations, making them pop out. By doing this, this was one way to really enhance the model and bring it up to its full potential. The next thing I want to mention involves the Bulldozer Plow that we have here. This is something that admittedly deviates from the real unit slightly in the way the unit would work on the actual vehicle that we're using for reference. The original Cat D4 did have this exact same setup here with the same frame, the same plow, and also with this triangular block. This version of the D4 is the version that utilized hydraulics to power the plow, as opposed to the Letourneau version that has an overhead cable type hoist setup. The hydraulic version was definitely used during World War II to a great extent, and that is the version that we have here. However, the real version that, or I should say the real example of the D4 that was being used as a reference, did have some modifications made to it in this area. That Bulldozer was modified at some point to have a 6-way positionable blade, and this was something that was done by adding several other hydraulics to the setup. Those hydraulics did transfer over to the 3D print one that we have here. I was thinking about possibly deleting them, however, the amount of work it would have required to do that was something that I just didn't have time for, so for this model I just left it in the configuration that we have it. Of course, it didn't stop me from going ahead and painting the units with the hydraulics in the silver color in these areas, as obviously they would be if a real version had this type of setup. And something like this, I wouldn't be surprised, was field modded at some point in time, as these D4s were heavily modified by the units quite often. So is this something that is realistic? To a certain extent, and it's definitely more than plausible. But for this model here is just an interesting quirk that I did want to point out. Obviously, if you're building or rendering this model as the civilian version, you know, all of that practically means nothing. While on that note, though, you can see the other hydraulic lines that are coming off of the model over here. These were integrally 3D printed to the unit, and I didn't add anything to it in that regard. The only thing that I did was I painted all of the hydraulic lines with black to, of course, replicate the rubber hoses that are used on the real examples. Also, on the portion over here that comes out of the Grasshopper, one thing about the D4 is that underneath the brush guard over here is the hydraulic pump, and the hydraulic pump has the two main hydraulic lines that come out and run to the control lever, which would be found right over here. Well, those two lines are actually made out of steel tubing, so you can see how they are rendered on this model. I went ahead and painted them with the same OD that's found on the remainder of the vehicle. One bit of detailing that I did add to this model, and it's more or less a nod to the real vehicle that was being used as reference, is the underside here of the fuel tank. Well, on the real D4 that we have, there are these two brass fittings and a little bit of plumbing found in this location. And for this model, I wanted to bring those details onto this rendition. The fittings themselves are just made out of some small sewing pins that were drilled into the bottom portion of the gas tank and then just secured in place. The wire is just some thin floor wire that was added and bent to the shape that you see here. Also, as a nod to the real one, I went ahead and rendered them in the natural brass color as they are found on the real example that I just referenced. And true to form, I even went ahead and added little sweaty weathering features to it because, again, this is exactly what the piece looks like right now as I looked at it when I was building this model. Moving up takes this little box over here, and again, this is a nod to the real vehicle that was being used as inspiration. On that vehicle, there is a box that was fabricated in this section over here, but this was something that was fabricated by my father and myself. On that vehicle, we needed it because that box contains two lead-acid batteries that are used to power the electric starter that the Bulldozer was modified with at some point. Well, on the model here, I left the box in place because, well, boxes like this found on the top fenders would not be uncommon and can be used for a multitude of things, for the use of storage of tools, to also being used to house the batteries that would power or start up the electric starter for the pony engine, which would have been located in this area over here. And you can see some of those details on the model right here. So rather than trying to hog out and mill out these details, I might as well just leave them and incorporate them into the build, which is exactly what I've done. On that note, you can also see the little shovel that is secured on this section over here. Again, this is as per the real vehicle, and one thing that's also interesting is that on the real vehicle, the shovel has U.S. military surplus tie-down straps to strap the shovel in place, and here we go, full circle on the model here. I basically painted them in the exact same configuration. The next thing to mention is the driver's compartment, and this is something where I couldn't leave well enough alone, and I went ahead and deviated from the kit, adding some more details that were scratch built. The way the model is designed out of the box is that the three main controls are represented. This would be the throttle and the two steering clutches. However, some of the details that I added would include the brake pedals, which are found on each side here of the clutches, the stick shift for the transmission, and also the main clutch for the transmission. All three of these details are absent on the original model and were fabricated with using metal bits. The pedals and the stick shift are made out of using sewing pins that were bent to shape and then were added by drilling small little holes into the model over here with a pin vise and a small Dremel bit. And the transmission clutch stick itself was fabricated out of a piece of floor wire and then was just painted in the format that we have here. Of course, all of the controls have black plastic knobs on them, so I went ahead and replicated that on the model. One other thing I want to mention is with this area over here, hopefully the sheen should pop out on camera. On the real vehicle, if anyone can recall from watching the walk-around video I did on the actual Bulldozer, there is this little cap that's found in this area, and this is used to lubricate several of the joints and bearings that are found on the inner portion here of the transmission. And as I mentioned in that video, that little component is something that would easily have oil and drips type stains that would be present if the vehicle or the machine was used often. And on the model over here, I stayed true to form and I rendered it in that following format. Also, on a similar note, here you can see the rear ride-on gas tank, which is a really iconic bit of detailing found in this powered vehicle. And you can see the weathering that I did in this location over here, because obviously it wouldn't be too hard to have a drip or two of the diesel fuel when you're topping off the fuel tank. Also on this area, you can see the other modification that I made, which was to amputate the provisions for the umbrella, which was integrally molded in this section over here. It's kind of ironic that I went through all that work designing that elaborate setup to protect the umbrella from manufacturing and from shipping, only to, when I get the model, to utterly obliterate its very existence because it's just not necessary for this particular build. The integral printed in detailing found in this section over here was polished away with a Dremel with a high-speed removal bit, and also it was removed once I got closer to the areas over here with more precision with the use of a needle file. And of course some sandpaper doesn't hurt as well. Once all of those units were removed, this here is the final outcome, and as you can see, it looks pretty seamless once completed. The next thing I want to mention is the little canister that we have right here mounted on the side fender. On the real vehicle that was used as reference, this is a fire extinguisher that was added by my father and myself. This detailing, of course, carried over into the model that we have here, and rather than amputating it, I decided, as you know, just to leave it in place, again, as a nod to the real vehicle that was used as reference. The only difference is that rather than painting it red, on this example here, I just painted it in the dark olive drab that you see here. And it does add a little bit of extra detailing to the model as a whole. Moving our way back to the driver section takes us to the rear seat section here, which I gotta say is a really comfortable chair in person to sit on. The unit is just the stock sections, and the only thing I did to them was paint them in the black color that we see here. Of course, these sections are heavily padded and are made out of a black leather material. So on the model here, I just simply painted them with black, and I weathered them in the format that you see here to give them a more aged look to them. The next bit of detailing I want to mention is the air filter, and if anyone has seen a Cat, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. On the bottom portion here, we have an oil bath sediment filter, but also on the top there's this vortex type filter that pre-screens the air prior to going into the oil bath, and the sediment that gets collected accumulates here in a glass jar. Of course, the glass jar is rendered on this model here, and with the model being rendered in the HD material, the whole model as a whole is translucent. So, on the example here, I went ahead and stripped the paint off after the model was fully painted, leaving for the translucent effect that we have present, which gives a lot of accuracy to the model as opposed to just leaving it all over painted. Because the model, again, is made out of that translucent material, this just lends itself to render this fitting in this format. From the air filter takes us to the hood, and here you can see some of the detailing found in this section over here. The first two are the oil and fuel filler caps for the Pony. Of course, the Cat D4 had a Pony engine that would heat and start the actual main diesel engine, and in order to top it off, you have two filler caps in these sections over here. Of course, I went ahead and added my drip and oil staining weathering into these two locations. And then that leads us to the main exhaust and the exhaust for the Pony. The units were weathered in my usual format, and of course I went and added some soot detailing or soot effects into these two locations for reasons that should be fairly obvious. The same type of detailing and weathering was carried over into the side manifolds that we have right over here on the side portions of the model. And if you flip it over to the opposite side, you should be able to see a few of those details underneath all of the hydraulic equipment that I touched upon earlier. So that's it for the external details, and this brings us to the paint and the markings. Obviously, to make this a military bulldozer, I went ahead and painted it with my World War II shade of olive drab paint. This is the same paint that I've touched upon on many videos that are found on this channel for vehicles being rendered in the same era. In addition to the paintwork, the model was also weathered with my usual techniques with use of washes and filters, bringing it up to the condition that we have here. And the other weathering techniques would include a few different colors of dry brushing. Namely, on the remainder of the vehicle, you can see the dry brushing added to give you the chipping effect. And also for the front section over here, I dry brushed on some silver paint to replicate the steel starting to poke through the painted blade body. Of course, if I wanted to render this vehicle to be a little bit more used, this area here would have a lot more weathering effects done to it, which would then also evolve into rust. But I didn't want to make the unit look like it was that heavily used. On a similar note, the tracks also received a dry brush of steel to replicate the grousers having their paint worn off the surface. Obviously, these tracks not being rubber clad, if you ever drove one of these things for about 10 feet, basically the tracks would look like the way you see it on this model, specifically if you're driving on pavement. If you're driving on dirt or any other softer surfaces, the paint tends to hold on a little bit better, but it will start wearing off in due time. Of course, being a World War II military vehicle, you need to have at least one star present. And on this model here, I went ahead and added the markings in the following locations. The first one is right here on the hood, and the second one is right here prominently on the rear of the gas tank. The marking locations were something that I was able to find several reference photographs of, and I was able to apply them to the two locations that you see on this build. The markings themselves are spare water slide decals that I had in my spare bin. The decals, if I'm not mistaken, came from a 1/48 scale Hobby Boss M4 Sherman tank kit that I built many, many years ago, so it was good finding these old decals and utilizing them on this build. The decals, although they were as old as they were, the quality on them were still excellent, and they went on without any problems. They transferred over from the wet paper to the model, and then the entire markings themselves were sealed onto the model further with VMS matte varnish. The matte varnish was applied to the entire model, and this is something that I've been utilizing ever since I started using this product, because the VMS matte varnish has this trick where it just makes the colors look more vibrant compared to leaving the model varnishless. And this is again another reason why I highly recommend this product, and the reason why I'll be continuing to use this product for the foreseeable future. So now that you've seen what the model looks like in its military configuration, I might as well take the opportunity to show what the model looks like in an alternative paint scheme, because on loan from the owner, I have here his production sample of the exact same model, but in civilian format. Obviously, it's the exact same model that I turned into the military one, but here's what it looks like with the original configuration with the umbrella in its present location. Also, the owner went ahead and developed markings for the model where he made his own water slide decals, and it supplies you with all of the appropriate markings which would be found on the Cat D4, which would include the ones right here on the rear portion of the fuel tank, as well as the markings right there on the hood itself. And it is interesting to see the two patterns of these vehicles lined up side by side, and even though they are the same vehicle, it just shows you just what a different coat of paint can do to the model as a whole. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the link to the Shapeways store that sells the model in this configuration here can be found in the video description. And without a whole lot of elbow grease, you can take this model here and turn it into its military counterpart. At the end of the day, I'm pretty happy on how this one turned out. This was a model that basically just fell into my lap, as most good projects usually are, and it went together in hardly no time at all. And now that I went ahead and completed it and built it up to the state that we have here, not only do I wish I had a real Army Cat D4 Bulldozer, but this one here is definitely going to be a nice addition to my collection. And it's also a rather unique addition to the collection as well. Just like with the Bob Semple build, this was a ridiculously fast build to undertake. I had the whole project from start to finish wrapped in about 2, maybe 3 hours max, and most of that time was probably waiting for paint and varnishes to set. Even with the modifications that I added to this model, it was still a ridiculously quick build. And I guess this is a perfect point to pivot us into skill level and recommendations. Normally, When I do these type of videos, I come up with a reason why a model should be recommended for someone of a certain skill set. With this one here, it's not really as cut and dry because of a couple factors. First is the medium that this thing is rendered in. Opposed to the other models that are seen on this channel, which are generally, injection molded polystyrene kits, this one here being a all 3D printed piece may be something that a beginner might not necessarily have a whole lot of experience or even comfort with working with. The other thing is with the actual model itself. With the model out of the box, it's more or less intended to be a civilian version of the Cat D4. And in this guise, a beginner can theoretically get one of these models, paint it up, and enjoy it for what it is. However, in order to properly remove the bulldozer from the housing, the protective housing that it was in that I mentioned earlier on, you do need to have some special tools in order to do so. Of which, as a quick refresher, were a pair of clean cut snips, which if you're building models is a no-brainer. You should have that, or else you really shouldn't be building plastic models at all. But the other thing is a little bit more specified, and that is a Dremel with a small router bit. The router bit, in my opinion, is absolutely required in order to get the unit off of the base in an intact manner and do it in a way that doesn't cause any damage to the dozer itself. This tool here may or may not be something that a beginner has in their toolbox or even has the experience with working with. If the person does have the availability to purchase those tools, I recommend this model then because it is a fairly simple build. You free it off the sprue and then it's all with the painting. However, if you are looking to convert it into the military configuration that I have done here, this will require you to work outside the kit confines, and you are going to have to delete several aspects of the model, of which again I went over in this video. To do this, this will require a certain skill set that a beginner might not necessarily have, and because of that, as a whole, really this model I recommend for an intermediate to an advanced range builder. By this point, the builder should have the skills as well as the tooling required in order to free something like this off of the printed base, and also to have the paintwork knowledge in order to take one of these 3D printed pieces and paint it in a way that they'll be successful with it. And if you're the type of person that has a very advanced skill set and are really good with working with scratch building and modifying models out there, this kit here does open itself to a lot of possibilities. The Cat D4 is a very widely used bulldozer, and there's 101 different versions under the sun. And basically, if a person is really that determined and is that knowledgeable about the subject, they can easily take this model from the configuration that it comes with and go way past even the version that I've done over here. This, of course, will require a bit of scratch building knowledge, but again, if you're the type of person that likes to roll up your sleeves and work on something like that, perhaps this one here might be something to look into. The next thing I want to mention is recommendations, and this is where this model, in my opinion, becomes very, very interesting. Of course, O scale is generally considered between 150 and 148, and since 150 and 148 are so close to one another, you can easily use the two interchangeably and there wouldn't be any real problems. And this is fantastic because 148 scale is a common modeling scale for military vehicles and tanks. If anyone's watched this channel in the past, you'll see that I've done several reviews on many models in 148 scale, be it from Bandai or Aurora, and of course Tamiya and AFV Club do have kits in this scale as well. 148 scale, as I commonly mention, is a scale that goes in and out of vogue, like fashion, and it's not uncommon for there to be periods where 148 scale in terms of armor isn't really happening, but there are other times where it is the in thing to do. In fact, I believe we're on the precipice of this because some of the modern super kit companies are dabbling in 148 scale, but that's a topic for another video. Regardless, if you're a fan of building and collecting 148 scale tank models, the addition of this one over here is a addition that I would recommend because it's a great way to add a very unique subject matter to your tank collection. As opposed to your standard garden variety tank or even a armored vehicle of one sort or another, bulldozers are something that they're kind of like in between the two, and they are really interesting in their own right. And a military dozer like this is definitely something that always is an eye-catching piece if you have one in your collection. The one group of people who I cannot recommend this model enough to would be anyone who is a fan of rendering dioramas. 1/48 scale, outside of being a somewhat niche and fashionable scale for tank builders, is also a very popular scale for dioramas. And if you are trying to make a diorama scene, the addition of a bulldozer is one that always adds a ton of interest and uniqueness to the setting. The Cat D4 was widely utilized during World War II in both theaters, as I've touched upon a few times in this video, and because that, this really does open up the possibilities that a individual has for rendering out a scene. On top of just, armor type individuals, if you are a fan of airplanes, I don't need to tell you that 1/48 scale is a hugely popular scale for that genre. And if you are working on an airplane diorama, these Cat D4s were quite often seen around runways because they were generally what we were used to build the runways and what we're used to maintain the runways. So having this type of a vehicle in that type of scene would definitely not be surprising at all. And if anything, would be a real way to add, again, some uniqueness and some variety to your setting. On a similar note to dioramas, if anyone has O-gauge or O-scale trains, obviously that's the whole reason why this model came to being, was for use with that type of a hobby. If you're looking for something interesting to tow on your rolling stock, this model here would definitely look good and would fit the bill quite nicely. Not just with the military configuration, which is something that you can obviously do, and people have, YouTube videos of military-themed trains on flatbed specifically, but of course with the civilian version with the out-of-the-box configuration, that too would also greatly help your O-scale train layout immensely. The last person who I would recommend this model to would be anyone who's an avid fan of collecting Caterpillar merchandise. Of course, Caterpillar is a very popular company, and their merchandise and models are also something that is sought after. If you're the type of person that just appreciates the brand and likes collecting model bulldozers of one flavor or another, or if you have a real one sitting in a tent outside your house, having one of these models here in your collection is definitely something that you will appreciate. And with that, that wraps up this video for this 1/48 scale Caterpillar D47U Bulldozer. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.